Hi, I'm John Ridley. Welcome to Critical Content, a celebration of some of the year's most outstanding documentary filmmaking. Critical Content is produced by No Studios and sponsored by the American Family Institute for Corporate and Social Impact. In March of 2020, as his family began quarantining at home during the early days of the COVID-19 lockdown, David Siev picked up a camera and started filming what he believed would be just a series of home videos. What David captured, he turned into the documentary feature Bad Acts, named for the small town where the story takes place. The film itself has been called nothing less than a penetrating assessment of the American society at the time of the pandemic. And Bad Acts took home the Audience Award at the South by Southwest Film Festival. And I will say that Bad Acts is among the most American of films that I personally have ever seen. Please welcome to Critical Content the director of Bad Acts, David Siev. It's so good to see you, and congratulations on a truly extraordinary film.
No, thank you so much, John. I really appreciate you having me here today and just your kind words about it being an American film. That really means so much to me, so thank you.
I'll tell you, one of the things that I really related to is that your story, it truly is an American story, but I related to it because I also grew up in a small town in the Midwest where the otherization, I felt maybe wasn't direct, but was something that came to me later. I want you to start. There's so much to talk about with this film, but I think it's really important for people to understand, A, Bad Acts as a small town in the Midwest, and your story and the story of your family. So start, please, describe Bad Acts, a small town in Michigan. That's correct?
Yes, Bad Acts, it's a small town in middle of nowhere, Michigan. You know, we like to use our hands, so it's right here in the thumb. And population, less than 3,000 people. Demographically, it's about 97% white. And I guess, you can call it 3% of other, right? And that's where my family falls in. We've lived there since 1998. So we're coming on 25 years now, actually, which is incredible to think about. But yeah, it's a very small town, 2 stoplights. There's a Walmart and we have like a Meijer, 2 grocery stores, and it's a charming community. Everyone knows everyone. And I always say, at the end of the day, I would not have picked anywhere else I could grow up than this small town, Bad Acts, Michigan. And I think everyone in my family would say the same exact thing.
So talk a little bit about your family, because your family, it's the immigrant story, it's the melting pot story, and this is where I come to, it's one of the most American stories because your family really represents not just a diverse background, but a background and a family that's come together and really represents the values of hard work, keeping your eyes on the prize, and representing all that America is about.
No, absolutely. I mean, this story of Bad Acts, it was one I always wanted to share because when I look at what my parents specifically were able to accomplish in this country, it just so much epitomizes what the American dream is. My mom, she's a Mexican-American woman, doesn't have an education beyond high school. My dad, he's a Cambodian refugee, the same exact thing. As soon as these two graduated high school, they didn't have the opportunity to get a higher education, so they got to work. They started off by opening up a donut shop and while also running a Taekwondo school. And this was outside of Bad Acts, actually. It was in 1998 was when my dad decided to build his first donut shop. And that's sort of the history of how we ended up there. But no, it is such an American story because I've said this, that America is a country that's built on so many of the experiences of those like my family, this immigration, this refugee experience. And so when we talk about what the American experience is, the dialogue needs to include, I guess not only white Americans and people who've been here a long time, but also, the immigrants, the refugees, the people who come to this country seeking a better life, and were able to do that. And my parents, my dad specifically, he was able to accomplish that in this country.
You talk about in the film that your experience was different, but people don't understand there's value in those differences. Our experience is part of the American spirit. It's so, I think for a lot of us, we know that. It's so wonderful to hear people say that no matter what you will go through, you don't lose your love of this country. You don't lose your love of everything that it has to offer. Very quickly, I do think it's very important for people to understand. You talk about your dad in particular being an immigrant. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there who just think, well, immigrants, they just come here to take. They just come here because America's the golden ticket. Your father came from Cambodia. Talk very quickly so people understand about the Cambodian genocide, the Khmer Rouge, the killing fields.
Yeah, absolutely. So my dad, he was 16 years old when he came to this country. So he survived the Cambodian genocide that took place from 1975 through 1979, where over 2 million Cambodians, they don't even have a number, that's just an estimate, was killed in the country. He lost 7 members of his family, including his dad and many of his aunts and uncles. But he was able to make it out of the concentration camps and escape to Thailand with my mom and his 5 siblings, and come here in America in 1979. And there were a lot of people, a lot of Cambodian refugees who were able to escape the genocide, but there were also so many other people who they met a very unfortunate fate. That including my grandfather, who to this day we never knew what happened to him. But my dad and his mom and his 5 siblings, they were fortunate enough to make it out of there alive.
And also, I think people should understand during that time period, America did fight early in the war against the Khmer Rouge. So people coming from Cambodia, these were refugees that we welcomed. I think that's very important to remember as your story goes on a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
At one point, you left home, went to the University of Michigan, pursued a film career in Los Angeles and New York. So just anecdotally, as we start talking about the film, you did leave Bad X for a while. You went out into the wider world, not expecting to come home, but then 2020, the pandemic hits. You come home to quarantine with your family, correct?
That's correct. That's exactly what happened. I was living in LA as soon as I moved out from the University of Michigan, and spent many years working underneath this director, Jeff Tremaine, who some of you may know, but he's the creator of the Jackass franchise. He taught me so much what I know about just guerrilla filmmaking and really doing things yourself. And it was in 2019 when I moved to New York right before the pandemic. And then shortly after, March 2020 comes around, me and my wife, she was just my girlfriend at the time, but now she's my wife, and we moved back home. And that's where I picked up the camera and the story of Bad X, at least a documentary, began.
So when you started filming, what was the intent? Just that feeling that, hey, this is something we're all going through that we never went through before. And you just want to capture it? Because as we talk about this film, what it is about evolved so much. What was your intent initially?
It's kind of what you were saying. It was the intent of knowing that this was an interesting time that we were all going through, and wanting to have a memory of that, wanting to make sure that this was something that we could look back on. But this other intent behind it was I've just always have loved capturing my family in photographs and videoing them, and so that's what I was always doing. And it was an interesting time where we were all living together, especially during a pandemic. I guess there was sort of that foresight, is when is this ever going to happen again, where we're all just under one roof living together as a family. But as like I mentioned, I've always wanted to share my family's story, and that's where the filmmaking began to evolve. Was that this American dream story, that I always thought I would maybe write a script about and tell in a narrative sense, was actually unfolding every single day during the pandemic in the form of what I was capturing, during 2020, where this American dream was being challenged, now more than ever with the pandemic, with the racial reckoning our country was going through, and just how divided, our country was and our community was. It was as if, everything, this American dream, everything we worked for close to 20 years, was caving in on itself, and we had to find a way to keep fighting to keep that alive.
Well, what you're talking about, the American dream, what constitutes the American dream, who gets to decide that. That is a very potent part of the filmmaking. But to me, one of the things that was so searing is the passions of your family that you recorded. There's a scene very early on, I believe it's your older sister Jacqueline, if that's correct, where she's talking to your father, who's so passionate about the business, and your parents, they seem to not be able to stay away from the business. They want to go in every single day. Obviously, in the early days of the pandemic, as the bodies are, the death count is rising, there's such fear about who may catch this pandemic. There's a moment where your sister is so passionately talking to your father about the only thing that matters to her is his health. Not the restaurant, not the money, not anything, not the so-called American dream, but his health. And it's basically a harbinger for so many more passions that your family expresses about different things. Were you concerned early on about being so naked and so open about showing your family? Or to you, was that just, this is normal, this is who we are, it's a passionate group of people, and you're just capturing what you see every day?
It really was that. This is, our family, we have a lot of passion. My family, they were always comfortable with me filming. At times, the camera doesn't ever feel like it's there, because growing up, the camera's just been an extension of who I am. It's just like another part of my body. So when I'm capturing these very intense and emotional, moments, I am, there is a conscious thought going there that I do, want these moments to be real. And and when I capture my family, I it's not just the good moments I've always captured. You capture everything. And then it becomes so much more intentful to include those tough conversations in the editing of this film, because that's when you have to decide, for me at least, what to include and what not to include. And when you're painting a portrait of a family, and you're trying to, share everyone and paint them exactly as the imperfect humans that we are, you have to show you have to show all those moments, even if they may have been very emotional going through, or, emotional to capture. But I was fortunate that my family was so brave in allowing me to do that, as far as, including those moments in the edit.
Yeah, that is what struck me, is that this was not just, our family, are we wearing masks? Are we not? How do we get our food? It was so raw in its expression of emotion, but beautiful in that expression. To hear your sister just in tears saying, Dad, the only thing that matters to me is you, to Mom, this family, was absolutely remarkable. There's a moment in the film where your dad is driving, he's talking about that, and talking about wearing masks, and talking about a moment where he's coming out of a store and these young kids, and I believe he says they're sitting in a pickup truck. He paints this picture of a particular kind of individual, but they start going at your dad about, who are you to wear a mask? Go back to where you came from. This is where I brought up, or ask you to please talk about the killing fields and the fact that your father, what he went through to come to this country. At a moment like that, when you're filming your father starting to talk about his feelings of people who are never going to get my story, even though he'd been in this community, been a business owner, contributed in every conceivable way, there are people who are never going to get his American story. Did you start to feel what this film is about, or that narrative potentially shifting from, hey, I'm just documenting my family, to there are bigger issues here, and they're starting to boil up?
Absolutely. That was sort of this evolvement we're talking about in this film, where it became, instead of just a pandemic diary or home videos, where there was this realization that this American, story I was sharing, where I talk about this American dream being challenged, and, this otherization, where the moments like that, where my dad is talking about he's in Walmart and kids are telling him to go back to where we're from. It was important to show that, because that's what was happening in our country, not only to my family, but to so many other families like mine living in communities like Bad Axe, Michigan, of what we had to go through, being told, being called a Kung flu virus and told, go back to where you come from. Right. This wasn't just specific to our family. this was specific to so many families, so many Americans in our country. So it was around the time where, the Black Lives Matter movement happened, where I think the light bulb really went off, and you're seeing this community, customers start commenting saying they're going to stop supporting the business, and people saying, oh, they support Black Lives Matter, so we can't come to their restaurant anymore. It was then when I realized that, oh my gosh, like there is a larger story of my family being told here about America that's going on right now that we're living through.
Yeah, it would have been, I think, very easy for you to allow this film to self-indict a lot of myopic individuals in this area. But you didn't do that. And one of the things that I really appreciated, you take a moment in this film to focus on a young lady who is an employee at your family's restaurant, who talks about growing up in a very cloistered environment, having not necessarily a narrow-minded view, but a narrow-minded perspective, because that was the only perspective she had. But she talks about knowing your family, talks about how that was an introduction to all different kinds of people, and talks about how that made an impact on her. How important was it for you to either make sure that the film wasn't one kind of a message, or to allow people to have voices that, again, spoke to the beauty of knowing people and knowing people as individuals? Once you know people, it's very hard to, hopefully for most people, to oppress or denigrate other individuals because we see ourselves in them.
Yeah, that was so important. And, I'm going to be honest that in the early days of when I was editing this film, I was going through my own stuff as well, as far as just being so angry and frustrated where we were at, as a country and as a community. And so much of that frustration and anger really showed itself in those early cuts. And it was when I showed that to my family where they're like, well, what are you doing? People aren't going to, they're not going to listen. They're not going to watch this film if that's how you're going to, portray our story. And honestly, I think it's because I let my own emotions take over, and I lost sight of like why I was even making this film. I think I wanted to hop on my soapbox and point out all the problems that were, going on in our country, when that would have shut out, more than half an audience. So, coming back and with the question of why am I making this film, right? That was something I really had to think about, for several weeks in the edit. And it was to open up this idea, this dialogue of what needs to be included when we talk about what it means to be American. And going with that perspective, it was, I was able to, really take a step back and say, okay, I need to focus on the most personal lens of this family. I need to, rather than, tell everything that's going wrong, point out everything that's going wrong with our country, just show it through the most personal lens, the most personal experience through these individuals in the restaurant and my family. So that's why it was important to include, someone like Skylar or even Austin's experience, my sister's boyfriend who is Black. It points out, everyone is going through their own issues and their own journey, just like how we all were, I think 2020 was so formative for everyone in this country. We all had our own things we were going through, and you're just zooming in on this restaurant and you're seeing it from the perspective of, this Cambodian Mexican family, but also the people who make up that restaurant as well too, like Skylar and like Austin and because that's, to me, it's almost like a microcosm of what America is if you zoom in on Bad Axe and you zoom in on Rachel's, the restaurant.
Yeah, you mentioned in an interview talking about your family restaurant, and you talk about us as a society losing that communal experience of just going to a restaurant. And you say that the restaurant, your family's business, is much more than just a restaurant. It's about that communal experience. It's about people coming together. You mentioned Austin, your sister's boyfriend. Again, a fascinating character because he's Black, one of the few Black people in the town. He's adopted. his
Yeah.
parents are white, there's a moment where he just talks about how difficult, how painful it is for him to just even talk about blackness and talk about being black in a small town. We're talking to David Siev. He is the director of the remarkable film Bad Acts. You mentioned that you didn't want to get up on a soapbox and just proselytize about your views on America, but someone else's soapbox almost arrives to your film. There's a moment where you capture individuals who are, if they're not self-described neo-Nazis, certainly in the moment, they're offering up Nazi salutes and being very supportive of that. I believe it's during this Black Lives Matter rally, which in and of itself, this small town rally, not knowing who you're going to get, it's just an incredibly tense moment in your film. And there's so many beautiful moments, tense moments, personal moments. But after that, literally your family begins to get into it with neo-Nazis and people who begin to threaten and people who begin to say things like, you are digging your own graves. It's very frightening because it is so real. For you as a filmmaker, there has to come a point where you start to ask, not just what kind of a film I'm making, what is this film going to do for my family? And in fact, you do ask those questions in the film. What was going through your mind when it wasn't just a notional exercise about capturing America, but potentially inviting the worst instincts of America, or frankly, any country, to your doorstep?
Right. It was, that was a really scary time when, we were getting these letters and hate mail, and people were following my sister, and then, phone calls from, life-threatening phone calls from neo-Nazis, right? It was terrifying. And there becomes a real moment in the film. You see where my mom turns to me and she says, you don't live here, David. And she's so right about that, because at the end of the day, when this is all said and done, I get to go back to New York, but my family has to put up with the consequences of my actions of making this film. And so, it was never a question of whether or not I was going to continue filming, but it was more so, I needed to have everyone on board in my family. I needed their trust. I needed their approval to tell their story, because I would never have put this film out there. I would have released this edit had my family not all been on board. And that's why I really kept them involved as much as I can in the editing process. So when, I mentioned coming to this realization that I just had to show our experiences for what they were. That included showing those really, scary moments, because at that time, what was going on in Bad Acts and, social media, people were taking the sides of these men and validating our experiences. People were saying, oh yeah, it was those Civ kids that went up and they were instigating these guys. And it was many of those people that never even attended the rally or the protest. So you can imagine for myself, like, that was incredibly frustrating for everyone in our family. That was incredibly frustrating to hear how community members were unknowingly, taking the side of these white supremacists and finding ways to justify their actions without them even knowing the full story and what happened that day. And so by being able to capture all of that and show the real fear, and I think bridge this gap and create real empathy with audience members and allowing them to be in our shoes. Had I not done that, and had it come from a place I was pointing fingers and I said, everyone in this community is wrong for doing this, those people wouldn't even have watched the film in the first place. And now that people have watched it, and even the same skeptical people who were the ones leaving social media comments and the ones that were stopping my mom in Walmart and telling her they can't support the restaurant anymore because of what I was doing, those people have since watched the movie since it's been out. And it's been really powerful to witness that, to hear these individuals say, oh my gosh, I don't agree with your family's politics, but I'm sorry, I was wrong. And thank you for opening up an experience I just did not know existed in our community. Because when you watch the film, that's the truth. That's exactly what we went through. It's not embellished in any sort of way at all. And I think when audiences see that and they're like, oh my gosh, how did I not know this was going on, with the Siev family and let alone in the Bad Axe community? It just took people a chance to walk in our shoes and experience something that was, an experience that was different from theirs.
Yeah, you make a point in this film about acknowledging the people who may not agree with your politics, may not agree with how you see the world, but continued to support you, continued to support the restaurant. And then certainly, as you mentioned, other groups of people who are like, wow, I never knew. I just never knew what it was like, what you went through, and I'm there for you. You called this film a love letter to Bad Axe. You cannot watch this film and not feel that this is a love letter to Bad Axe. This is certainly a love letter to your family, to their experience.
Absolutely.
And most importantly, this is a love letter to America, that everything that this is about, the American experience is about, and what makes this country, in my opinion, and I think in your opinion as well, probably the greatest country on the planet. You and I sitting here having this conversation really proves that this is, sorry, no disrespect to other nations, probably one of the greatest countries in the world that you and I can sit here and talk about the things that we love and making films. David, just a remarkable film. Congratulations. All I can say is I cannot wait to see what you do next. Congratulations on Bad Axe.
No, John, thank you so much for the time. I'm so grateful to have had this conversation with you, and I absolutely agree with everything you just said. So thank you. That's beautiful.
My pleasure. This is John Ridley. This has been Critical Content. We appreciate you joining us. Thank you.